Most people think a debt disappears because nobody talks about it anymore. It doesn't. Some people believe if enough time passes, everyone simply forgets. They don't. Some people think when the phone finally stops ringing, the story is over. It isn't. Sometimes the silence isn't the ending. Sometimes it's the beginning of an entirely different chapter. A chapter most people never see coming. One day, the calls stop. The letters stop. The emails stop. And you finally breathe. You think they gave up. They forgot. You think it's over. Then one afternoon, your phone rings. It's a company you've never heard of. They're asking about a debt. You don't even remember borrowing from them. Now you're wondering, who are these people? How did they get my information? Why are they calling me? And perhaps the bigger question of all, how can someone I've never done business with say I owe them money? Today, let's talk about the answer. Welcome to the Real Credit Talk Show, audio edition. I'm your host, Tiana Mayers, also known as Lady T. Founder of Beyond Credit Limits Corporation. And this is where we break down how credit actually works. Not from opinion, not from guesswork, but from how the system is designed to read you. This is a Beyond Credit Limits production. If you want to understand how your situation connects to what we talk about here, visit www.beyondcreditlimits.com. And if you've been tapped into the brand, you already know what it is, www.thatmerchmood.com. This is a space where we stop repeating credit myths, stop chasing surface level advice, and start having conversations people don't even realize they should be having. Not the watered down version, not the social media version, not the version people throw around without context. A real conversation. A conversation that helps you understand what is actually happening when your name, your information, your accounts, your behavior, and your decisions all come together inside a credit profile. A conversation when your financial decisions, your financial habits, your financial relationships, and your financial history. So wherever you're listening from, I want you to settle in. Because this conversation is not just about credit. It's about something much bigger. It's about understanding how your financial story can continue moving even after you believe it's standing still. Now let's go. Today is not about your credit. Let me say that again. Today is not about your credit. Today is about what happens after a company decides they're done waiting. It's about the moment an unpaid bill stops being just an unpaid bill and quietly becomes someone else's business. Have you ever looked at your phone and ignored a number because you didn't recognize it? I'm sure I've done it. Have you ever opened your mailbox, seen a company name, and immediately thought, I've never done business with them? Maybe even asked yourself, how do they even know who I am? Those questions are far more common than most people realize, because somewhere along the way, people started believing that silence means something disappeared. That if enough time passes, the problem somehow solves itself. That if the original company stops calling, the story must be over. But what if the story never stopped? What if while you were moving on with life, your debt was moving too? Think about it for a second. Not your intentions, not your explanation, not the reasons life became difficult. The debt. Because sometimes the biggest financial surprise isn't finding out you still owe money. It's finding out someone else now owns the conversation. And if you've never thought about that before, stay with me now. Because by the end of today's conversation, I don't just want you thinking differently about debt. I want you thinking differently about what happens when your financial story keeps moving without you. Welcome to episode 14 of the Real Credit Talk Show. I'm Tiana Mayers, Lady T, and today we're going to have a conversation that millions of people have experienced without ever fully understanding it. Not because everyone ends up in collections, but because almost everyone knows someone who's looked at a letter, answered a phone call, or reviewed their credit profile and asked, who are these people? Right? Well, today we're going to answer that question. And by the time we're done, I think you'll realize the conversation was never just about debt. It was about understanding what happens when your financial story continues long after you thought it was over. Now, I want you to picture something. You're cleaning out your drawer. You're going through old paperwork. You come across an envelope from a few years ago. You stop for a second and look at it and shake your head and quietly say, I remember this. You smile because you honestly believe I'm past all of that now. You throw it away, close the drawer, and move on with your day. Then 2 days later, your phone starts ringing. The person on the other end says, I'm calling regarding an outstanding balance. And before they can finish, the first thing out of your mouth is, wait, I don't even know who you are. Now let's stop right there, because I think that that's one of the biggest moments of confusion people experience. They're not confused because someone says they owe money. They're confused because the name changed, the company changed, the logo changed, the address changed, the phone number changed. Everything changed except the debt. And that's where today's conversation begins. Not with blame, not with judgment, with understanding. Because once you understand what's actually happening, you stop asking the wrong questions and you start asking much better ones. Can I ask you something? Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable people become when someone they don't recognize knows something personal about them? Think about it. If a complete stranger walked up to you and started talking about your personal business, you would immediately ask, how do you know that? Financially, the exact same thing happens. Someone you've never borrowed money from knows your balance, knows your address, knows enough information to contact you. And naturally, your first question becomes, how? Not why, how? Because in your mind, your relationship ended with the company you originally borrowed from. But what if their relationship with the debt ended before yours did? That's a completely different conversation. Here's something I don't think enough people realize. Money moves. Businesses move. Companies merge. Companies close. Companies grow. Companies buy. Companies sell. And sometimes an unpaid account becomes part of those business decisions. Not because somebody woke up trying to make your life difficult, because businesses make business decisions every single day. Now, does that mean every situation is the same? No, absolutely not. Does it mean every unpaid account follows the exact same path? No. That's exactly why I don't believe in one-size-fits-all conversations, because every financial story has its own history, its own timeline, its own circumstances. You know what I find interesting? People almost always remember the day they opened the account. I remember buying my first car. I remember getting approved. I remember signing the paperwork. I remember moving into that apartment. But very few people remember the day the relationship changed. Because relationships rarely change overnight. They change little by little. One missed payment, one delayed payment, one promise to catch up next month, one unexpected expense, one difficult season, until eventually the relationship doesn't look the same anymore. And sometimes that's the part we never stop to think about. Think about friendships. Most friendships don't end because of one conversation. Maybe you stop calling each other. Maybe life gets busy. Maybe people move. Maybe priorities change. One day you realize you haven't spoken in years. The relationship changed long before either of you admitted it. Financial relationships can change too. Not dramatically, not overnight, quietly. And sometimes by the time people realize something changed, they're already having a conversation with someone new. Now, here's something I want you to really think about. When people tell me, Tiana, I don't even know who this company is. Or I've had a few recently call in and say, Lady T, I don't even know who this company is. I understand their frustration because from their perspective, they never borrowed money from that company. That's true. But here's the better question. Are you looking at who originally loaned the money or who's involved with the account today? Those are two different conversations. And if you don't separate them, nothing else makes sense. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that silence means resolution. No phone calls, no emails, no letters, no reminders. Silence. And silence has a funny way of making people feel comfortable. We start telling ourselves, maybe they forgot. Maybe it just went away. I guess everything worked itself out. Can I tell you something? Hope is not the same thing as confirmation. Those are two different things. Sometimes the phone stopped ringing because the conversation was moving somewhere else. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not saying every unpaid debt ends the same way. I'm not saying every account changes hands. I'm not saying every situation becomes a collections account, because it doesn't. What I'm saying is this: assumptions can become expensive, because when we assume instead of understand, we usually don't realize what's happening until we're reacting to it. And reacting is always harder than understanding. You know something I've noticed after all of these years talking with people? Very few people come to me because they enjoy talking about credit. They come because something happened that didn't make sense. A denial, a phone call, a letter, a company they've never heard of, an account they thought was over. And somewhere during that conversation, they almost always stop and listen and say, I never thought about it like that before. That's the moment. Not because I told them something magical, because we stopped guessing and started understanding. And that's exactly where today's conversation is headed. We'll be right back.
Most people think credit is just a score. It's not. Your credit can affect where you live, what you drive, your interest rates, approvals, deposits, business funding, and even the opportunities available to you. At Beyond Credit Limits, we help consumers understand how the system actually works. This isn't about gimmicks. This is about structure, strategy, education, and financial positioning. Whether you're trying to rebuild, organize your financial profile, understand collections, prepare for home ownership, or create a stronger financial foundation, Beyond Credit Limits was built to help you move with intention. The consultation is where everything starts. We will review your situation, identify what's happening inside your credit profile, and map out the next steps based on your goals. Stop guessing, stop moving blind, and stop letting misinformation cost you financially. Visit www.beyondcreditlimits.com and fill out your consultation today. Again, that's www.beyondcreditlimits.com. Beyond Credit Limits, because financial freedom starts with understanding the system.
And we're back. Let's get into it. You know, there's something I realized after having thousands of conversations with people over the years. Most people aren't shocked that money can be owed. They're shocked by how quickly the conversation changes. One day you're talking to a company you recognize. The next, you're trying to explain yourself to the company you've never even heard of. And that's unsettling. Not because the balance suddenly appeared, because the relationship changed and nobody prepared you for that part. Have you ever gone back to a restaurant you've been visiting for years only to find out it has a new owner? The building is the same. The menu looks familiar. Some of the employees are still there. But something feels different. Why? Because ownership changed. Now, think about that financially. The balance may look familiar. The dates may look familiar. The account may even look familiar. But now, someone else is a part of the conversation. That's why people become confused. They're looking at the same debt through a completely different relationship. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine you sold your home. You don't own it anymore, but the home still exists. Someone else now owns it. Someone else now has rights connected to it. The house didn't disappear. Ownership changed. Sometimes people assume debt works differently, but financial obligations can move just like other assets. And understanding that distinction changes the entire conversation. Now, here's something I really want you to think about. The moment people hear the word collections, they immediately attach emotion to it. Embarrassment, failure, judgment, stress, fear. But what if before we attached all those emotions, we first understood what was actually happening? Because understanding doesn't remove responsibility. It removes confusion. And confusion has a way of keeping people stuck. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people making decisions from panic. The phone rings, they panic. A letter arrives, they panic. Something appears on their credit reports they weren't expecting, they panic. And panic rarely leads to good financial decisions. Understanding does. That's why I always encourage people, don't make your first decision, your emotional decision. Make it your informed decision. Those two decisions usually look very different. Have you ever noticed how quickly bad information spreads? One person says, "My cousin told me." Another person says, "I heard." Someone else says, "They can't do that. They have to remove it. You don't have to pay them. They're just trying to scare you. They can't report that." Before long, everybody becomes an expert based on someone else's story. But here's the problem. Your financial story isn't somebody else's story. Your credit reports isn't someone else's profile. Your circumstances aren't someone else's circumstances. And that's exactly why general advice can become very expensive advice. You know what I love about consultations? It's the moment someone stops telling me what they heard and starts showing me what's actually there. "I heard" doesn't tell me anything. Here's what's reporting. Now we're getting somewhere. "I heard they had to" doesn't answer the question. Here's what's actually on my credit reports. Now we can have a real conversation. That's why I always tell people, don't build your financial decisions on secondhand information. Build them on verified information, because assumptions have never improved a credit report. Let me ask you another question. If somebody contacted you today about an account, would you know where that account actually stands? Would you know who currently owns it? Would you know how it's being reported? Would you know whether what you're being told matches what's actually being reported? Most people, honestly, don't know. Not because they're irresponsible, because nobody ever taught them what questions to ask. And that's one of the biggest reasons I wanted to have today's conversation. Not so you leave thinking you know every answer, but so you leave asking better questions. Because sometimes one better question changes the entire conversation. Here's something else I don't think we talk about enough. Ignoring something doesn't always make it worse. but it almost never makes it clearer. Think about that. Clarity comes from understanding. Understanding comes from information. And information comes from looking instead of avoiding. That's true in business. That's true in relationships. And it's certainly true when it comes to your financial life. One of my favorite moments during a consultation is when someone stops and says, wait, that's what that means? Not because I told them something complicated, because we slowed down. We stopped assuming. We stopped guessing. And we started connecting the dots. That's where confidence comes from. Not knowing everything. Understanding enough to know what you're actually looking at. Maybe that's what today's conversation has really been about. Not debt, not collections, not phone calls, not letters. It's about replacing confusion with understanding. Because once confusion leaves, fear usually begins to leave with it. And when fear stops making your financial decisions, clarity finally has room to take its place. All right, it's time for one of my favorite parts of the show, questions from the community. Let's see what came in this week. Before we jump into today's questions, I want to say thank you because, again, every week you trust me enough to send your questions. Some of them come from frustration, some come from confusion, some come from people who've been carrying the same question for years. And I don't take that lightly. I just gotta say that, and I will continue to say that. Because asking a question means you're looking for understanding, not just another opinion. If today's conversation made you realize I've been looking at this differently, good. Because that's exactly why this show exists. Not to make you feel bad, not to scare you, not to overwhelm you, but to help you think in a way you may not have thought before. If you'd like your question featured on a future episode, send it to The Real Credit Talk Show at beyondcreditlimits.com. Include your first name and state, or simply write anonymous. Either way, I read every single one. All right, let's get into today's questions. Selena, Kentucky. Lady T, ew. I received a letter from a company I've never heard of. I honestly thought it was a scam. How am I supposed to know the difference? All right, Selena, that's a fair question. Because if someone you've never done business with suddenly starts talking about an account, your first instinct is to question it. And honestly, you should. Not because every letter is wrong, but because understanding who you're communicating with is always important. Before making assumptions, slow the conversation down. Find out who they are. Find out why they're contacting you. And most importantly, understand how it connects to your financial story. Because clarity always comes before decisions. Damien, California. Can a debt really be sold more than once? Ooh, that's a really good question. Damien, that's one of those questions that catches people off guard. Because most people think there's one company and one conversation. Financial situations can be much more complex than that. That's why I always encourage people, don't assume you know the entire story based on one letter or one phone call. Sometimes there are chapters you haven't seen yet. Aaliyah, West Virginia. I stopped answering unknown numbers because every time I did, it was somebody asking for money. Was that the wrong decision? Aaliyah, I understand why people do that. Nobody enjoys stressful phone numbers. But here's something to think about. Ignoring a conversation doesn't always stop it. Sometimes it just means you're no longer participating in it. And when that happens, you're making decisions without information. I'd much rather see someone make informed decisions than emotional ones. Bryson, North Dakota. Why didn't the original company just tell me what was happening? Bryson, that's another question I hear quite often. People expect every step to be explained, but life doesn't always work that way. Neither do businesses. That's why it's so important to understand your own financial situation instead of waiting for someone else to explain it to you. Knowledge puts you in a much stronger position. Anonymous. If I honestly don't remember the debt, where do I even begin? You begin by understanding, not guessing, not assuming, not reacting, understanding. Because before you decide what your next step should be, you need to understand what you're actually looking at. And those are two completely different conversations. Jocelyn, Alabama. Lady T, why does this all feel so overwhelming? Jocelyn, because for most people, this isn't just about money. It's about uncertainty. It's about wondering what happens next. It's about not knowing whether you're making the right decision. And when people don't understand something, their imagination usually fills in the blanks. That's why understanding is so powerful, because it replaces fear with clarity. Xavier, Louisiana. Hey, what's the biggest mistake people make once they realize an old debt is still affecting them? Trying to solve it before they understand it. Think about that. Most people want answers immediately, right now. But sometimes the better investment is slowing down long enough to understand the situation first. Because strategy built on assumptions usually creates more problems. Strategy built on understanding creates better decisions. Anonymous, what's the biggest lesson you hope people take away from today's episode? You know, somebody asked me that before. I don't remember which episode, but in any event, that's an easy one. I hope people stop believing that just because the conversation became quiet, the story was over. Sometimes the quietest moments are when the biggest changes are happening behind the scenes. And once you understand that, you stop looking at your financial story 1 month at a time. You start looking at it as a journey, a story that's still being written. Let's bring today's conversation back together. We started with a question that probably sounded impossible. How can someone you've never borrowed money from say you owe them money? At first, it doesn't make sense. until you realize the conversation didn't begin the day the phone rang. It began long before. And that's really what today's episode has been about. Not just debt, not just collections, but understanding that financial stories don't always end where we think they do. Sometimes they simply move into another chapter, a chapter we didn't know existed. Because while you were thinking the story was over, the system was still reading it. Not emotionally, not personally, just consistently. And that's a very different way to look at it. Today wasn't about making you feel guilty. It wasn't about making you feel embarrassed. It wasn't about making you afraid to answer your phone or open your mailbox. It was about replacing assumptions with understanding. Because once you understand how the system sees the story, you stop reacting to every new surprise. You start recognizing how the story got there. And once you understand how it got there, you're in a much better position to decide where it goes next. You know, one of the things I've learned over the years is that people don't usually need more opinions. They need someone to slow the conversation down, to help them understand what they're actually looking at, because confusion creates fear. Understanding creates confidence, and confidence changes decisions. So maybe the biggest takeaway from today's conversation isn't about collections at all. Maybe it's this. Just because you stop hearing about something doesn't always mean it stopped existing. Sometimes the conversation simply continued without you. And that's honestly even in everyday life, not just financially. And that's exactly why understanding your financial story matters. Not because it changes yesterday, but because it helps you write a better tomorrow. If today's conversation taught you anything, I hope it wasn't simply that debts can change hands. I hope it made you realize that your financial story doesn't stop just because you stop paying attention to it. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that silence means nothing is happening. Sometimes silence simply means the story continued without you knowing. And if nobody ever explained that, how would you know? Right? That's why I don't believe people need more opinions. I believe they need more understanding. Because understanding changes perspective. Perspective changes decisions. And decisions have a way of changing opportunities. Maybe today's episode made you think about an old account. Maybe it reminded you of a phone call you ignored, a letter you never opened, or a company name you didn't recognize on your credit profile. If that's where you are, don't guess, don't assume, don't rely on what somebody else told you, because your financial story isn't their financial story. Every profile has its own facts, its own timeline, its own circumstances. And until someone takes the time to understand your entire credit profile, you're only seeing pieces of a much bigger picture. Sometimes those missing pieces are the difference between another denial and another opportunity, another question, and finally having clarity. That is why understanding matters. That is why your story matters. And that is exactly why you should know what your credit profile is actually saying about you. If today's conversation made you realize, I don't really know what's happening with my credit reports, you're not alone. In fact, that's one of the biggest reasons people contact beyond credit limits. Not because they're looking for someone to simply tell them what they want to hear. They're looking for someone to help them understand what they're actually looking at, because those are two completely different conversations. Our credit review consultation is designed to help you understand what's reporting, how your credit profile is being interpreted, and what may be affecting your financial opportunities. Not somebody else's profile, yours. Because every credit profile tells a different story. Every financial journey has a different beginning, a different timeline, different circumstances, different opportunities, and different challenges. That's why I don't believe in one-size-fits-all advice or one-size-fits-all strategies. Because before you can decide where you're going, you first have to understand where you are. If today's episode made you stop and think, I need to know what my credit profile is actually saying, don't keep guessing. Visit www.beyondcreditlimits.com. Complete the consultation request. And let's start with understanding, because understanding is where better financial decisions begin. Before I close, I want to leave you with this. No question is insignificant. Your questions matter because you matter. Knowledge creates options, and options create leverage. Just because the company changed doesn't mean the conversation ended. Sometimes the conversation simply changed voices. If today's episode made you stop and think differently, don't let today's conversation end here. Take what you've learned, ask better questions, look for better answers, and don't be afraid to understand your own financial story. Submit your questions to the Real Credit Talk Show at beyondcreditlimits.com. Include your first name and state, or simply write anonymous. Your choice. I read every single one. And your question may be featured right here on a future episode. Remember, every credit profile has a story. Every financial decision adds another chapter. The goal isn't to pretend yesterday never happened. The goal is to understand what your financial story is saying today so you can make better decisions tomorrow. This has been the Real Credit Talk Show, hosted by me, Tiana Mayers, also known as Lady T. Founder of Beyond Credit Limits Corporation. Visit us at www.beyondcreditlimits.com. And if you've been tapped into the brand, you already know what it is. www.thatmerchmood.com. Until next time, keep learning, keep positioning, and keep moving with intention. The Real Credit Talk Show is a Beyond Credit Limits production. Visit us online, www.beyondcreditlimits.com. Official merchandise, www.thatmerchmood.com. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.